Hi, in this video, we'll be pretending that we're a data analyst working for some office supply company. Our boss will be asking us several questions that he needs answered for him to make important business decisions. Now, to help him answer these questions, we'll be using an extremely powerful Excel tool called pivot tables. Now, if you don't know what pivot tables are, let's just say it's an extremely important tool for any data analyst as it helps you structure and analyze your datasets. I'd say pivot tables is more of an advanced topic, but we'll start slow and build up from there. So without further ado, let's begin analyzing. Alright, first things first though, let's take a look at our dataset. We're dealing here with some basic company information. We have the unit price, the customer ID, customer name, and so on and so forth. Maybe a more interesting column will be the weekday helper, which is simply a numerical display of the weekday. For example, Wednesday is 3, Saturday 6, and so on and so forth. Why we need this, I'll show you later. And maybe we have an order ID and whether the order was returned or not, false or true statement. Now, the very first thing we must do before we can work with anything when using pivot tables is we have to make sure that our dataset is in a tabular format. Just to briefly explain you what I mean is if we don't specify Excel that this is a table, it only sees it as some data range. It only understands that all of these cells are connected by a single thing, which is that they're adjacent to each other. But they do not form a table that we can work with in more detail later. So to make sure that our data frame is a table, we click anywhere on our data, we click Insert, and then Table. We make sure that the range is correct. It will be correct. It just fills in all the non-blank cells. We click OK. And now we know that this is a table since every second row has a different color. I will explain later why this is important, but for now keep in mind that this is the very first step you must do before working with pivot tables. Now that we have created our table, we have to turn it into a pivot table. So we click anywhere on our table, we click Insert tab, Pivot Table from Table Range. We select the range that we want to create a pivot table from. By default, it selects the whole table for us. Then we select where we want the pivot table to be created. It's a good practice to have it created in a separate worksheet. So we'll just keep this option on. We click OK. Now that we have two separate worksheets, we have to rename the second one so that we know what is where. And just like that, we have our first pivot table. So we can move on to the boss's questions. So the first thing our boss wants to know is how our customer segments are distributed when comparing their profits, meaning which is the most profitable segment, the second profitable, and so on. So we click anywhere on our pivot table, and on the right hand side we identify this big box. Each of these tick boxes represent a column in our original dataset, and each of these boxes can be dragged and dropped. Below we can see these four fields, one for filters, columns, rows, and values. So we identify the customer segment field, we drag and drop it to the rows, and as we can see we have four customer segment rows. Now we want to compare their profits. We identify the profits box, we drag it to the value field, and now we have each customer segment's sum of profits. By default it shows the sums. We can change that, but for now let's change something else. We first right click on one of these sum of profit cells, we click value field settings, we click number format, and then select the currency format. Since these are dollars and we want to show them as dollars. Now we can see the distribution of profits across all these segments, and let's say we also want to see the percentage distribution of each of these segments. So we identify the profits box once again, we drag it to the values field for the second time, we have the same exact field that we had before. This time we click on it, we click value field settings, and we go to show values as. in this drop box, we select percentage of column total, click OK, and just like that, we have percentages of each of these segments. We can rename these columns, so let's call this percentage. Delete this one. Now our boss sees this, and he wants to see the exact same distribution of profits and percentages, but not for the customer segments, but for the product subcategories. To do that, we can just copy and paste the same exact pivot table. We click anywhere on it, and we have the same pivot table fields dialog box open. We keep the values as they are. The only thing we want to change are the rows, so we can drag and drop it away from here. And this time we select the product subcategory box. We drag it to the row field, and we have the same exact thing for the product subcategories. I hope by now you're starting to understand the power of pivot tables and how easy it is to manipulate data, to organize it, and to make very quick analysis. So let's jump on to the second question. So the second thing our boss wants to know is whether there's some tendencies when comparing the amounts of orders made across different weekdays. Maybe we make more sales during Fridays than Saturdays and so on. Furthermore, he wants this information split amongst all of our cities. So first thing we do is we copy and paste our pivot table, and we drag away all the fields that we don't need. We select the city box and drop it to rows field. We have our 4 cities. Now we find the order ID, drag it to values. As mentioned before, by default pivot tables organizes them by sum, so we'll need to change that. We select any of our order cells, click value field settings, and change it to count. Now we have the number of orders for each city. Next thing we do is we identify the order weekday column, drag it to columns, and we have the distribution amongst all of the weekdays. First thing I need to do here is to disable the ground totals since we don't need them. I click anywhere on the table, click pivot table options, totals and filters, and I disable both of these boxes, which stand for showing ground totals for rows and columns. Next thing is I want to reorganize the order of our weekday distribution. As we can see, it begins by Sunday. So if you're using the newest version of Excel, which is Excel 365, you can simply do this manually by just dragging the field wherever you want. Now it's organized in the way that I want it to be organized. If you're using an older version of Excel, this might not be available, and this is where our weekday helper column comes into play. As I mentioned before, I prepared this custom column that simply displays the weekday as a numerical value. We have the Wednesdays as 3, Saturdays as 6s, Sundays as 7s, and so on. So we select this box, weekday helper box, and we drag it to columns. We drag it above our first column, since the one that is above is the one that is being ordered by. We right click on our field settings. We disable the subtotals since we don't need this information to be duplicated. And just like that, we have the same style of sorting as before, but this time we're sorting by this number. If you want to change the visual appeal of this table, you can simply hide this row and we have the same result as before. But since I can use this option, I'll just drag and drop it manually. Now the final thing I want to do here is to turn this into a heat map. So I select the whole range, I go to Home tab, go to Conditional Formatting, Color Scales, and select an appropriate color scale. Now the darker the color, the more orders are being made in that particular combination of city and weekday. As we can see, there's no real tendencies that can be identified here, which is also an answer to our boss's question. All right, moving on to the next question. So the third thing our boss wants us to do is to make an intuitive tool for him to be able to easily filter all of our pivot tables at the same time. So there's 2 approaches to this. First, if we click on one of our pivot tables, we remember that we have this filters field over here. So let's say we'll filter by cities. We drag the city box into the filters field. We see that this filter has now appeared, and we can select any of the cities that we want to filter by. However, if we're dealing with multiple pivot tables, this isn't intuitive, since we'll have to create this filter field for each of our pivot tables, and we'll have to manually readjust it every time we want to refilter it. This is where a thing called slicers comes into place. So we click anywhere on one of our pivot tables, we click pivot table analyze, and then insert slicer. We select the column that we want to filter by, city in our case, and now we have a slicer. At first glance, it looks exactly like before, like the filter, because if I select one of these values, only the single pivot table is being affected. However, we can connect the slicer to any pivot tables that we want. If we want it, we can connect the single slicer to all of our pivot tables at the same time. I will want to connect it to the first two pivot tables and to have it no connection with the third one. Since the third one, our heat map already has the cities as rows. It wouldn't make sense to filter them by these cities. So we click on our slicer. In the slicer tab, we click on report connections, and then we connect them to our pivot tables. One thing we haven't done is we haven't renamed our pivot tables, which is a good practice, because now it's rather difficult to understand which pivot table stands for what. If we had 20 or 30 of these pivot tables, it would be way more difficult to understand that, but since we only have 3, we can manage. So I connect them to pivot table 6, which is the first one, 7, which is the second one, and number 16, we don't want the connection. We click OK. And now each time I filter, both of these pivot tables are being readjusted. And the third one is untouched. If I hold down the Control key, we can have multiple criteria. And we can simply click Clear Filter to clear everything. So that's it for filters, or slicers in this case. So that's it for our first video about pivot tables. Keep in mind that we just barely scratched the surface with this one. I hope by now you get an understanding of how powerful this tool really is. In my following videos, I will be going into more advanced topics of this pivot table tool, and you'll see how powerful your analysis can become when using it. For now, thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video, and I guess I'll see you in the next one.